The Boyd's forest dragon is a prehistoric-looking Australian lizard found only in the dense rainforest of northeastern Queensland. I've been keeping this species for the last 6 years and managed to breed them consistently, so here's a video that summarizes how I care for them. The enclosure I keep them in is a 4x4 by 2 feet foam ply enclosure, which is very water resistant but at the same time retain heat much better than glass enclosures, which is particularly important for winters here in Melbourne. If you live somewhere more tropical, then too much heat and too little ventilation might be a challenge. That's where glass enclosures with screen tops would work much better. Usable vertical space is the most important for them. They like vertical or angled branches the most, and I've also frequently seen them resting on horizontal branches. I achieve that by screwing flat bases to each perch so that they can stand upright by themselves, and they're stable enough once the substrate is in, weighing them down. I use a combination of live and artificial plants to create a dense rainforest look, and they also serve important roles like drawing up moisture from the soil and releasing humidity in the air, and act as visual barriers to reduce stress and tension between the dragons. The substrate I use is a combination of cocoa peat, sphagnum moss, and eucalyptus mulch. I consider my enclosure a semi-bioactive setup. There are roaches and some worms in the substrate to break down waste, but I still try to remove the bulk of them whenever I see some fresh species. I don't have a drainage layer, as an extensive root system from the pothos is enough to prevent the soil from getting bogged. These dragons come from closed canopy forests, where there are very little light that actually makes it down to the forest floor. They have adapted to be thermoconformers, meaning they don't tend to actively bask and just fluctuate with the ambient temperature. For that reason, they don't cope well with high heat and intense basking spots. I run an Arcadia Shade Dweller T5 UV tube for UV and Arcadia Jungle Dawn for plant growth. These lights are on smart timers where the day length corresponds to seasonal changes. They go from 12 hours in summer down to 10 hours in winter. Both of these lights emit just enough heat that I don't need a designated heat source in the enclosure. I don't regulate the enclosure temperature with thermostats, but the ambient temperature in my reptile room and the insulation properties of my foam ply enclosures mean that my enclosure usually stays between 25 to 33 degrees Celsius in the warmer months and 15 to 27 degrees in the colder months. I also don't monitor and control humidity in the enclosure, but just let it fluctuate. Having damp soil, live plants, and frequent misting is enough to bring the humidity up to adequate levels. Spraying the enclosure down is the main way they drink, but I've also seen them drink directly from still water in a bowl, so I always make sure to leave some there. I spray them down every 2 to 3 days, and occasionally do a very heavy spray to get everything soaking wet to simulate heavy rain. The Boyd's forest dragons are insectivores. I feed them 95% roaches, and the rest are just whatever I have on hand, like crickets and worms. I always dust my feeders with calcium powder before feeding, and they are fed once every 2 to 3 days. Once their enclosure set up and husbandry requirements are met, breeding almost comes naturally. As the day length becomes longer, and the temperature becomes warmer, which brings up their appetite, mating will begin. I don't ever separate my adult breeding Boyds. I have 1 male and 3 females living together year-round. Having more than 1 male would almost always lead to territorial issues, and having just 1 or 2 females might lead to damaged crests and spines, as the males might repeatedly mate with the same 1 or 2 individuals. I've never had fewer than 3 females with my male at any point. That way his attention is divided across 3 females, and I believe that, together with the visual barriers from branches and plants, are the reason why I haven't had any issues with damaged crests. From my experience, females lay 2 to 5 eggs in moist soil, around 5 centimeters below the surface. They might guard the laying site for a short while, but I've never had issues removing the eggs for incubation. I've had eggs hatched out in the enclosure substrate before, but I've also witnessed new hatchlings getting eaten by adults, so I always remove the eggs for incubation from then on. I've had more issues during incubation back when I was using sphagnum moss as the substrate. Since switching to perlite, with 1-to-1 ratio by weight with water, I've had nearly 100% hatch rate from fertile eggs. I incubate my eggs in a heat-cool incubator that I made, which allows me to fluctuate the temperature ranging from 21 degrees to 26 degrees. It takes them around 100 days to hatch in that temperature. Once they hatch, they can take a few days to start eating, sometimes even up to a whole week. I keep them with UV from above and a heat mat underneath to prevent the nighttime temps from dropping too low. In the past, when I had my hatchling enclosures out in the living room, I also used ceramic heat emitters and halogen downlights as additional heat sources during winter to keep them eating and growing. I feed them the same types of insects but just smaller sizes, and they're fed and sprayed more frequently than adults, usually around 5 times a week. In summary, Boyd's forest dragons are great lizards to keep, as long as what you're after is not something that you handle daily. They're not as difficult to care for as people once thought, and with the right setup, they can be relatively low maintenance and forgiving lizards.